Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to ESG Talks, a KBRA podcast series focusing on environmental, social, and governance, ESG. This podcast series highlights various ESG hot topics and includes commentary from prominent voices within the ESG community. In this episode of ESG Talks, I interview Lisa Peto from Mindset. Mindset is a bipartisan public policy firm that blends thoughtful research and analysis, strategic advisory services, and sophisticated advocacy to address the challenges and opportunities their clients encounter in Washington. Given the continued focus on ESG in public policy circles, Mindset also helps its clients navigate the evolving suite of ESG policy issues, leveraging their deep expertise in financial services, energy, environment, and other relevant policy arenas. Lisa and I talk about the state of ESG disclosure regulation in the U.S., including California's recent climate disclosure bill, as well as the status of the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC's climate disclosure proposal. Hi, Lisa. Thanks so much for coming on to discuss the status of ESG disclosure regulations in the U.S. Most recently, in mid-October 2023, California became the first state in the country to require public companies with revenues exceeding $1 billion to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions. And then the state will also require companies with revenues over $500 million to publicly disclose their climate-related financial risks as well as mitigation efforts. Can you talk about why this is an important step? And do you think other states are likely to follow suit?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to join you for this podcast today. The California law, as you mentioned, really has the potential to have a major impact and cover an enormous range of companies. I think it's really a landmark moment in this growing discussion around climate disclosure. I saw reporting indicating that 75% of public companies in the Fortune 1000 would be covered by it. So it really is just a massive scope. And it's really a meaningful step also just given the size of the California market that could really dictate national ESG policy. So I think what we could see is other blue states looking to implement their own similar laws, especially as liberal state officials have kind of been a little bit frustrated with the pace of SEC action and setting a national standard. But of course, if the California law is already in place, then the impact that other states would have from following suit would be a little bit less meaningful. But there's also a few factors that could actually soften the impact of the California laws. First, it's very possible that there will be a threat of litigation seeking to overturn it. And you might recall that California previously passed a mandate regarding board diversity that was struck down in court. So we could see a similar playbook being applied there. And second, the law actually doesn't have enforcement penalties until 2030. So this is a really long way from being effective. It's still, an enormous step. But even Governor Newsom has raised some concerns with the timeline and the impacts of the law, and he might seek modifications. So if there's additional delays, it could be close to a decade before the law truly goes into effect. And then one other quick thing I just wanted to mention on the other end of the spectrum, of course, there's red states like Texas and others that are considering enacting laws banning companies from issuing climate disclosures. So the issue is far from settled. And you're going to see, I think, just a continued polarization over the topic, even with these big steps like the one California has taken.
Yes, definitely ESG keeps being in the headlines in the US, and KBRA actually just put out a piece on the ESG backlash that's happening in the US states. So I would encourage listeners to give that a read. But you also mentioned the SEC proposal. So the SEC has also proposed climate-related disclosure for US companies. Can you give us an overview of what's included in that proposal?
Sure. So the SEC did propose its own climate disclosure mandate for issuers back in March of last year. So it's been, I think, about 18 months since that proposal has come out. It's similar to the California law in some respects. The SEC proposal would require disclosure of both scope 1 and 2, which are direct emissions, and scope 3, indirect emissions. But the SEC proposal only applies to public companies. Some critics have argued that the proposal in effect would apply to smaller private companies throughout the supply chain of larger public companies. But Chairman Gensler has said, that's really not the intent of the rule. And if they were to put out a final rule, he has said he would seek to clarify that. But that's just one difference. One thing to point out about the SEC's own rule is just the interaction between its role in the California law. So there's a few conflicting theories on how the California law would affect the SEC moving forward. One thought is that, one of the major concerns that has been raised about the SEC rule is the cost of compliance. And that might be one of the factors that has slowed the SEC in thinking through that compliance burden. So some have argued that California going first really helps the SEC potentially in its path to finalize its own rule, because that could affect the baseline in the SEC's cost benefit analysis, as many of the issuers would already be complying in California. So that dramatically reduces the cost of complying and knocks out really one of the main arguments that critics have put forward. Just a way to contextualize that is there would be an overlap of about 1,500 companies between California and the SEC. And one of the other main arguments has really been around the Scope 3 requirement. And that, has really slowed the SEC thinking through how to propose that in a way that could withstand legal challenge. So the California law may really reduce the need for the SEC to act on its own, because Scope 3 will have already become a sort of de facto national standard, again, with the size of the California market. There's other, key elements of the rule that have yet to been finalized. And actually, this is really timely because just today there was reporting that Commissioner Ueda, one of the Republican commissioners, said the agency may actually repropose the rule altogether. So there's a lot that is still yet to be determined. He likened it to ordering omakase at a sushi restaurant, and how that, is much more complicated and takes more time rather than just ordering sushi off the menu that's already prepared. I thought that was a funny analogy. So there's still a lot that needs to be figured out with this proposal. And there's also been a lot of, as I alluded to earlier, frustration from Democrats and other stakeholders that have really been pressing Gensler to move quickly and finalize the rule. But obviously that has not happened.
So you kind of mentioned that this proposal was originally announced in March 2022, and the final rule has been delayed. Now it's seeming like they may repurpose the rule. Do we have any sense of sort of timeline in terms of next steps or announcements that the SEC might be making around this rule?
Yeah, it's really hard to tell. So Chairman Gensler has made numerous public comments. He's testified before Congress several times, and it's kind of almost a running joke that he talks about the vast number of public comments that the rule received. And it's true, they did receive an unprecedented number of comments. And he's talked about, the time that it takes to go through that and how the SEC takes them very seriously. So that is certainly, it's a complex rule and they're working through it. He's really given no indication, though, of when he would cut off that process and put forward a final rule. There's been lots of different rumors about the rule coming out last month, I think, was the most widely circulated rumor. Obviously, that did not come to pass. We could see a rule before the end of the year. I think more likely a deadline that the SEC has in mind is the Congressional Review Act deadline, where Congress could use that tool to overturn the SEC's actions. That deadline is approximately August of next year. So that would probably be the latest that we would see action, just because whatever he puts out is almost certainly going to cause some sort of effort in Congress to overturn it. There's been obviously a lot of Republican pushback, but there's been fairly broad opposition, including from moderate Democrats, particularly those in agricultural districts that have really raised alarm bells about the impact of farmers. And then, another interesting component about the rule and possible delays, one of the key reasons I think the SEC has said it wants to move forward here is there's a need for standardization of this data. So a lot of this reporting already exists, and especially larger companies that operate in the EU and already have to do some of this reporting, welcome standardization and consistency. But it's not clear exactly how the SEC thinks that it will interact with the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD for short. That went into effect at the beginning of this year. And the SEC could pursue substituted compliance. It's just not clear that that's the path that they're going down. And so I do think that while, yes, there are, questions about congressional pushback, litigation, scope 3, cost burden, there are also, substantive issues that the SEC needs to figure out before it finalizes the rule. So it could still yet be some more time before we see something final.
So kind of looking ahead, there's a few other SEC ESG related proposals in the pipeline, including more transparency on ESG investment practices, human capital development management disclosure, and corporate board diversity disclosure. Do you have any sort of sense of when these proposals are likely to be released, or kind of any intel on the content that would be covered in these?
Yeah, so as you pointed out, the SEC has had a pretty robust agenda. The climate disclosure rule had really been at the top of that list. And I think for a long time, it's the same staff that work on all of these rulemakings. So I think for a long time, they were really hyper-focused on the climate disclosure rule. As that got a little bit sidelined, they did finalize recently the names rule, which was the first rule on its ESG agenda, just addressing allegations of greenwashing and using misleading or overstated claims to attract investors to environmental funds. But there's still more, as you mentioned, that they want to finalize. And that was an indication that moving forward with the names rule, that they might go ahead with some of these other ESG rulemakings, even if they still cannot finalize the climate disclosure rule. Another one that could move soon is the ESG disclosures for investment advisors. So this is a proposed rule that looks to see if there's a fund that's claiming to achieve a specific ESG impact, then they would really have to describe in a lot of specificity what they're seeking to achieve, and then summarize their progress on actually achieving those impacts. So they can't just say it's aspirational. They have to be moving towards those goals. That was proposed back in May of 2022, and that could potentially go final by the end of the year. As you mentioned, there's rulemaking around human capital management. This has not seemed to be a near-term priority, but again, that could change if action on the climate disclosure rule is further delayed to show progress on this broader ESG agenda. And then board diversity, as I mentioned, has really been stalled by legal challenge. So the SEC had approved a NASDAQ board diversity rule that required, listed companies to disclose board level diversity annually, and also explain, if they don't have diverse directors, why that is the case. The Fifth Circuit recently upheld the rule, but it's being appealed by conservative-backed group, and it could eventually go to the Supreme Court. So that is still very much an open question and kind of emblematic of problems that the SEC has had with their ESG agenda.
That leads very well into my last question, because I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the litigation risk with some of these ESG related disclosure efforts. What are the most present risks that they might face, and how do you think the SEC might be preparing for that?
Yeah, the SEC, I think, has litigation risk really top of mind. So the legal threat has been heightened since the Supreme Court's ruling in West Virginia versus EPA, which upheld the major questions doctrine. And that has really undermined federal agencies across the board, not just limited to the SEC, but really hinders their ability to take major actions without direction from Congress. So Chairman Gensler has argued that Congress has granted the SEC significant authority over disclosures generally. Opponents have really taken issue with Chairman Gensler seemingly regulating climate, and that, they argue, is something he does not have authorization from Congress to do. This is really kind of squarely in this major questions doctrine. I think there's arguments on both sides. Gensler has talked about the need for investors, for the public, for regulators to have this data, and again, for the need for standardization for it to really be meaningful, and that falls within his, authority to require disclosures to protect investors, and it's relevant to the securities market. But of course, there have been lots of concerns raised about the scope of his legal authority to act at all. Then there's also been, threats of litigation specifically around scope 3, I think because it is kind of unprecedented and, would require reporting on a scale that we really haven't seen. And again, this kind of comes back to the question of California moving first and potentially softening some of that impact. But certainly they have been, I think, taking their time because they want a rule that can withstand legal challenge, and that is going to be very difficult to achieve. there's also, just pushback across the board, whether it's congressional Republicans threatening subpoenas and requests for document production related to this rulemaking. Just that effort alone could slow them down. Obviously, it's different from a legal challenge, but it is still a way that Republicans are able to, slow down his agenda, and something that he's very cognizant of as he, I think, goes through this rulemaking. And then there's also just been a huge backlash. And you mentioned KBRA's work on this, but at the state level, there's been an increasing coordination, I think, on both sides with Democratic AGs and Republican AGs as well. So I think there could be further coordination at the state level to really make sure that if the SEC does finalize anything, it's almost certainly going to be met with legal challenge one way or the other, whether they drop scope 3 or significantly rework the rule or not. So I think that is very much top of mind, and we'll have to see if Chairman Gensler makes the decision to move forward and let the chips fall where they may.
Well, it seems like we're really kind of in the early stages of ESG disclosure in the US. So I think the next few months and the course of 2024, it's going to be really interesting to watch how it all plays out and how some of these final proposals come together. So thank you, Lisa, so much for coming on to chat about the disclosure efforts that are going on right now.
Thanks so much for having me.
This concludes our episode. Please email esg@kbra.com with any questions or comments. We also encourage you to visit KBRA's ESG website at esg.kbra.com, where you can find ESG research related to the topics discussed in this episode, further details on KBRA's ESG approach, and other ESG-related media items. You can also join our mailing list to access our ESG Weekly Roundup newsletter.